just like everybody, what started out as the leaving of the home into the world in a search to stamp meaning, definition, purpose, perhaps family, perhaps experiences, onto this life that one appeared to be given, began in earnest. I grew up with a mother and father. My mother was no longer around from the age 11, and my father did his best to bring home food, finances, masculine energy, and as much as he could muster in the things that he did and offered, love or feminine energy, which is both masculine and feminine, of course. And he gave me the best that he'd been given. Sometimes he made mistakes, and sometimes that was hurtful. And later on I was able to see that when I had the opportunity to look back at my own life, that I too made mistakes, and sometimes I'd been hurtful. So I became, as many of us do, the thing that when we're younger we think we fear, which is to become like our parents. But actually, my father did a good job, and he made numerous mistakes. And so far, that's me too. It's what we do about them and the capacity with which we are blessed to be able to acknowledge that, go back, put back what was taken and make amends in ways that we're able to, if those we've hurt would have us do so. So I left home and searched for love in all the wrong places. Sometimes I looked in the right places, but as it turned out, seemingly with the wrong people. I moved through numerous peer groups, musician friends, creative friends, angry friends, damaged friends, people that were like myself. Of course, we do seek our own, and we do seek community and companionship along the way, and my life's no different in that way. In order to both find exciting experiences to stamp onto sometimes mundane days, I was fortunate enough to encounter drugs, those being nicotine, alcohol, and then cannabis, psychedelics, and then so-called hard drugs. So my waltz through the first half of life is certainly a journey of the whole chemical conundrum, as I would call it. Mind-expanding ones and soul-shrinking ones. Moments sublime, intervals hilarious, abject misery and despair, and a lot of laughing. I would say the fundamental way in which drug dependency, not drug use per se, drug use per se is not exclusively destructive, but drug dependency per se, in its most compulsive and destructive, one of the primary ways in which my drug dependency at the time impacted on the lives of those around me was somewhat through the usual things, but mostly by being emotionally unavailable and operating out of the very brokenness that come with that. Having certain substances be my lover, was secondary to that. So, unhealthy relationships. That's not to say I was the only participant in the unhealthiness in my relationships. For sure, I've been in abusive relationships and violent relationships where individuals were violent towards me, and relationships where I've had opportunity to look back and see how some of my emotional, psychological ways of being violent, but not in physical ways, but nonetheless violence was present. As is said in some of the 12-step programs, any relationship I was in was bound to be dysfunctional because I was in it. And that's certainly true of me too. But all of it has been about asking questions. Man's search for meaning, to quote Viktor Frankl. Mine wasn't quite as bleak as his might be on paper. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who passed through Auschwitz and spent a brief period there before going to another camp. but his multi-million selling bestseller, Man's Search for Meaning, is that which I'm referring to. We all search for meaning. Man here is not a sexist term that we're talking about. The animal, the human animal. Mine has been much the same, you know, out of a resource of brokenness and grief and emptiness and my father's best efforts. I grew up in a house of unresolved grief. There was an empty chair where my mother once sat when she died of cancer when I was young in 1977. So I suddenly learned at an all too young age what death was, is and could be. And then cyclical deaths that happened in media and latterly around me just reignited that brokenness, that reinforced, re-enabled that brokenness. So I remember my sister Sarah opening my bedroom door on the day that John Lennon was shot. And at that time, I think I was perhaps 14, yeah, about 14, I knew what death meant. So although I had no relationship with John Lennon, meaning I didn't have any Beatles records, I just knew the Beatles because they're ubiquitous to English culture, to British culture, to world culture, as the archetypal pop act. And creative geniuses, of course, let's not underplay that. Especially, interestingly, when they began to take psychedelics, they become much more interesting, certainly to someone with a relationship with psychedelics like myself. I knew what my sister was telling me and the dramatic nature of that. And of course, what it did was bring me back in touch with the loss of my mother before I went off to school. There was another band I used to really like, a UK punk band called The Ruts, who did a really great amalgam of punk and reggae when that was a thing in the UK. And when Malcolm Owen, the singer, overdosed at the height of their success from a heroin overdose in the bath, I knew what that meant as well. I'm not sure what year that was. Sorry, Malcolm. But also the year my mother died, Elvis died. So if anyone remembers where they were when they were told Elvis died, that's the period in history I'm talking about. And I think Frank Sinatra died that same year. I remember there was 3 deaths and I knew a lot about what those meant. So out of that resource, out of that pool of emptiness, of unresolved grief, out of a consciousness of let's get on with it, pull our socks up, kids go back to school, my father go back to work, within a fortnight, we carried on. So from that brokenness and that emptiness and that limited sense of emotional availability, I forged my way into a world that I found confusing, difficult, and ultimately saddening, because the sadness would keep rounding on me. And of course, when sadness keeps rounding on you and you perpetually avoid it, what happens is you become very angry. Soon I hit puberty. Now that brings a lot of changes with it that, as I like to say, you know, puberty and really our teens, I feel certainly was for me, a period of development that we spend the rest of our life figuring out. It's traumatic being a teenager, and you know, everything's so either or, quid pro quo. I like this and I hate this. We like these things around here, we hate these things around here. Now all of that is, of course, is initiated in our earlier development as tiny children, where the morality of our family, the conditioning of our schooling, the likes and dislikes, the preferences of our culture and community are offered to us, and we develop naturally, as we need to for the first half of life, a very black and white view of the world. This is why by teenage years, when at the age of 13 you suddenly come to a place where you realise you have all the answers for everyone's questions, even though they haven't offered you any questions, but still you offer an answer. And we move into this, I like that, oh, I hate that, and all that kind of like lone wolfness. There's an isolation to living out of that kind of mind. Of course, some of us are taught other lessons earlier on that bring us through that at an earlier age. We have great young people that have great wisdom, but that wasn't this story, this individual story. I made my way into the workplace to discover I didn't like working. not of the type that I was able to access, not out of poor academic results as a result of living out of this pool of grief, and didn't really have a mind, didn't really have a perception, didn't really have a perspective on myself to know what I wanted to do when you leave school. I figured it out when I was about 37, what I wanted to do when I left school. I must get around to doing that, actually, yeah. So, one of the ways in which I sought escape earlier on as someone who at the time just drank beer and smoked cigarettes a lot and obsessed about relationships, because the desire to be loved had now joined with the desire to find that which was lost when my mother died, that is essentially feminine energy in all its glory, became very mixed up and jumbled up, and so I'd get into relationships for quite long periods as a young man. Between the ages of 16 and 20, I think I dated 2 people. One of those was for 3 years. And then I dated someone for 9 years, a very destructive relationship. And then I dated someone for 4 years before I met my wife. And I didn't spend too long on my own in those years. Only the period before I met my wife and that period before meeting my wife informed the rationale for marrying my wife when I finally met her, because I'd spent some time being independent and not codependent. But all of this, the inevitable questions about life, about its meaning, about my direction, about those likes and dislikes that I'd earlier made a commitment to, and which ones were now worthy of that commitment and which weren't. One of those was my love of music, that I'd lost myself in, that I'd disappeared into the fantasy land of creativity. I think it was inevitable. I was always going to be creative. And so I began making music. I bought a very cheap drum kit, went for an audition, couldn't really play, but, you know, kind of moved down that route and got involved in the local music community up in Essex in Harlow at the Square, and became part of that. I met some great people there that influenced me heavily. They influenced me politically, socially, emotionally, psychologically. They loved me, despite the difficulties that came with knowing me. And some of those difficulties inevitably hurt them as well. You know, as many of us are when we're young, but I'll just own my part in it. I was quite a selfish young person in terms of, I found it really frightening to ask for what I needed, so often I took it instead of asking. This is like borrowing things and putting them back sometimes, most of the time. But I did find some friends that I'm still in contact with that have a great affection for that. To me, are all some of the most inspirational people. They probably wouldn't see themselves as inspirational, but to me they were. They're just such a vital an integral part of the story of me as a younger person. But I always had an inquiring mind, an inquisitive mind, and I'd never really found it, whatever it was. And I think what I now know it was is happiness, but I hadn't really found happiness. I found pockets of it. I found temporary breaks in periods of happiness, and it was all very codependent and very needy and very destructive ultimately, because I wasn't operating out of fullness and wholeness. And I don't think most of us do when we're young. You know, we're still navigating the terrain of all the things there is to do, and our mind is filled with ideas of hope and filled with plans about plans and filled with ideas about where we're going to go, what we're going to do, and the wonderful and magnificent things we're going to achieve, and the ways in which we're going to dramatically impact on the lives of the people we encounter and the world per se before it's all too late. That's fairly natural and normal, I feel, and we should live out of that. This is all first half of life consciousness, where the tools that we develop through our conditioning and our upbringing and our schooling and our teenage years and perhaps our 20s to some extent, where we're underway with those tools, they're all still working. Of course, when we get to 30, 40, 45, 50, whatever, inevitably our resources for the first half of life must fail. life will come along, life will deal us bitter challenges, bitter blows that we couldn't plan for, because you can't plan life. You can't plan everything. You can plan the small details, and hopefully those plans will come off. But in the end, if we really look back and view over the whole of it, all of it, the entire story, try and work out how much of it you really planned, and did those things come in the way that you expected them to, or did life just keep spontaneously erupting, pro and con, difficult, challenging, beautiful, ecstatic, wonderful, surprising? Did life just come in the way that it came in the end? And I think most of us will see that that is the case, that life does what it wants, and we get to beautifully and universally participate in how it manifests, depending on your view, of course, arguably, you might say.